They called me a confused old woman, a fragile liability who was unfit to handle her own finances. So they brought a doctor to my home to have me legally declared incompetent. They had no idea I was letting them walk directly into the legal fortress I had built years ago, and that their entire scheme was about to publicly and spectacularly implode. My son and his wife called me a fragile liability, a woman whose mind had grown as faded as her watercolor paintings. They thought I could no longer be trusted with my own checkbook. So with quiet confidence, I let them walk straight into the legal fortress I had built with my lawyer years before, a fortress whose existence they never once suspected. They tried to declare me unfit to handle my own finances, but their scheme fell apart before it even began. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply waited for the truth to arrive, as punctual and as unforgiving as the Maine tide. This is the story of how they mistook my silence for surrender, and how they learned that memory, when properly documented, is the sharpest blade of all. My name is Margaret Hale, and my life has been one of quiet, steady work. The house my husband Robert and I built stands on a rocky point overlooking Penobscot Bay, a testament not to quick wealth, but to slow, deliberate love. He was a shipwright, a man whose hands understood the integrity of wood and the patient language of the sea. I was a nurse, and my life was measured in the steady rhythm of care and diligence. Every shingle on that roof, every pane of glass facing the water, represents a choice we made a vacation. We skipped a newer car we didn't buy. We poured our lives into this land believing we were building a legacy, not just an asset. It was here we raised our only son, Daniel. I remember paying for his college education with the money we had set aside for a trip to Europe. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was an investment. When he married Tiffany and they wanted to buy their first home, it was my signature on the co-signed loan and a check from our savings that made it possible. We never saw these things as leverage. We saw them as the foundation of family, the invisible mortar holding the bricks together. The first cold current arrived with Tiffany. She was all bright smiles and sharp, assessing glances. In the beginning, she called me Mom, a word that felt hopeful, if a little hollow. But soon, it became Margaret, delivered with a crispness that put a polite distance between us. The changes were small, at first easy to dismiss as generational differences. My homemade clam chowder was a bit heavy. The antique furniture Robert had so carefully restored was charming, but so dated. Daniel, my quiet, agreeable son, began to echo her opinions. He had always been easily swayed a boat without a strong rudder, and Tiffany's will was a powerful current. I remember one Sunday dinner, I was telling a story about Robert navigating through a thick fog using only a compass and his memory of the coastline. Tiffany interrupted with a light laugh. "Oh, Margaret, your stories are wonderful," she said. "But Daniel says you sometimes get the details mixed up." Daniel just looked down at his plate, his silence a quiet confirmation. It was the first time I felt it, the creeping sensation of being gently, kindly erased. I was not a person in their story. I was becoming a prop, a piece of sentimental background scenery that was slowly being moved out of frame. The house stands on a rocky point overlooking Penobscot Bay, a sentinel against the Maine winters. My late husband, Robert, and I did not buy it. We built it. We built it not with a swift loan that indebts the future, but with the slow, deliberate savings of two working people over 30 years. He was a shipwright, a man whose hands understood the integrity of wood and the patient language of the sea. I was a nurse, my life measured in the steady rhythm of care and diligence. Every shingle on that roof, hammered in place by Robert's own hands, represents a choice we made. Every pane of glass in the windows that face the water windows I polished weekly for 4 decades reflects a small dream deferred a vacation. We skipped a newer car we didn't buy. We poured our lives into this land, believing we were creating a legacy, not just an asset. It was here within these walls that smell of salt air and old wood that we raised our son, Daniel. I remember the year he was accepted to college. We had a savings account painstakingly fed, labeled Europe Trip. Without a second thought, we emptied it to pay for his tuition. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment in his future, a bridge we built so he could walk to a life better than ours. When he married Tiffany, and they wanted to buy their first home, a place of their own, in a quiet suburban town, it was my signature on the co-signed loan and a check from our savings that made it possible. We never saw these things as leverage. We saw them as the invisible mortar holding the bricks of a family together. A family I thought was a structure you built with love, reinforcing it with every selfless act until it was strong enough to withstand any storm. But they saw it differently. To them, the house was not a living album of a life well lived. It was real estate. The furniture Robert had so carefully restored was not a collection of memories. It was clutter. My history. Our history was not a foundation to be honored, but an inconvenience to be cleared away. They looked at the house on the water and saw not the 30 years of our labor, but a market value, a number on a spreadsheet. They saw a prize to be claimed. Their desire to control it, to seize it, was a direct assault on everything it represented. It was an attempt to say that our life, our work, our love was nothing more than a placeholder for their own ambitions. They wanted to inherit the structure without ever understanding the cost of the materials, without ever mixing the mortar. They believed ownership was a piece of paper, a key in a lock. They never understood that true ownership is moral. It is earned through contribution, through respect, through the quiet, thankless work of holding things together. This house was never just a building. It was the physical manifestation of a promise Robert and I made to each other, and I would not let it be broken by those who see value in everything and worth in nothing. Tiffany arrived in our lives like a sudden shift in the wind, a summer squall that appears on a perfectly clear day, all bright smiles and sharp, assessing glances. When Daniel first brought her to the house on the water, she was full of practiced warmth. She called me Mom, a word that felt hopeful, if a little hollow like a new key turning in an old lock. For a time, I allowed myself that hope, but the title didn't last. Soon, Mom became Margaret, delivered with a crisp, polite efficiency that put an unbreachable distance between us. It was a demotion. I was no longer a role, a relationship. I was just a name, a label on an object to be managed. The changes were small at first, the kind of quiet aggressions that are easy to dismiss as generational differences, as the natural friction of a new person entering a long-established family. My homemade clam chowder. Robert's favorite recipe was a bit heavy for a modern palate. The antique furniture he had so carefully restored with his own hands was charming, but so dated, don't you think? Each comment was a small, sharp stone tossed into the placid waters of my life. Daniel, my quiet, agreeable son, began to echo her opinions. He had always been easily swayed a boat without a strong rudder, and Tiffany's will was a powerful, undeniable current. He followed in her wake his own voice, becoming a faint echo of hers. The true nature of this cold front revealed itself one Sunday dinner. I was telling a story about Robert, about a time he navigated us home through a thick, disorienting fog, using only a compass and his memory of the coastline. It was a story about his strength, his quiet competence. As I spoke, I could feel the warmth of the memory, the pride in my voice. Tiffany interrupted me with a light, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Margaret, your stories are wonderful," she said, placing her fork down with delicate precision. "But Daniel says you sometimes get the details mixed up now. It's perfectly normal, of course." I turned to my son. I waited for him to defend me, to defend his father's memory. I waited for him to say, "No, that's exactly how it happened." But he said nothing. He just looked down at his plate. His head bowed and continued to eat. His silence was not empty. It was a choice. It was a confirmation. In that moment, he sided with her version of reality, a reality in which I was no longer a reliable narrator of my own life. Harm doesn't always come with raised voices. Sometimes it comes with a bowed head, with a quiet refusal to speak the truth. It was the first time I felt it, the cold, creeping sensation of being gently, kindly erased. I was a ghost at my own table, a curator of a museum whose new owners were already planning to sell off the collection. This wasn't just a new daughter-in-law finding her place. This was the beginning of a quiet siege. The campaign to paint me as incompetent was a masterpiece of quiet cruelty, a slow eraser scrubbing away at the edges of my identity until the whole picture became blurred. It was not a single dramatic act of malice, but 1,000 tiny, corrosive drops of condescension. It began with my mail. "Oh, Margaret, let me get that for you," Tiffany would say, intercepting the postman at the door with a bright, predatory smile. "It's so easy to lose track of bills at your age. We wouldn't want anything to fall through the cracks." Soon they were helping me with my online banking standing over my shoulder as I typed in my password, their combined breath a humid cloud of impatience on my neck. They spoke about me in the third person even when I was sitting right there in Robert's old armchair, a book open on my lap. "She forgot to take her heart medication again this morning." Tiffany would sigh to Daniel, her voice pitched just loud enough for me to hear clearly. "We really need to watch her more closely." I had not forgotten. I had simply taken it at dawn, as I had for the past 15 years, long before she was even awake. But to challenge her would be to seem defensive, confused, to prove her point. So I said nothing. Silence, I was learning, was a battlefield, and I was losing territory every day. They began to question every small decision, every flicker of my autonomy. "Are you sure you should be driving after dark, Margaret? The roads get so tricky. Maybe we should handle the grocery shopping from now on just to be safe. You might forget something important." Each suggestion was wrapped in the language of love and concern, but it was the wrapping paper on a box filled with control. They were not protecting me. They were building a cage bar by polite, considerate bar. I had become the background hum of an appliance, something noticed only when it was broken or in the way. I was a placeholder, a background character in a story that had long since erased my name from the script. My house began to feel like a foreign country where I no longer spoke the language. They rearranged the furniture, moving Robert's favorite lamp to the attic. They replaced my simple, functional kitchen utensils with a baffling array of modern gadgets I had no desire to learn. They were not just occupying a space, they were conquering it. It was a quiet, domestic form of colonization. Every action, every helpful gesture was designed to reinforce a single, devastating narrative: I was no longer capable. I was a problem to be managed. The woman who had raised a son, nursed the sick, and built a life from scratch was being systematically dismantled piece by loving, patronizing piece. And my son, my Daniel, stood by and watched it happen, his silence the most painful betrayal of all. He was not just complicit. He was the co-author of my slow erasure. Having successfully established the narrative of my gentle decline, the helpful suggestions escalated. They became more direct, more focused on the one thing that represented my last bastion of true independence, my finances. The campaign was orchestrated with the precision of a military maneuver, each step calculated to corner me. "You know, Margaret." Daniel began one afternoon, his tone heavy with practiced concern. He slid a newspaper clipping across the polished surface of the dining table, a table Robert had built with his own hands. The headline was stark: "Elderly scams on the rise, seniors losing life savings to sophisticated fraudsters." He let the words hang in the air, a silent accusation. I was old. I was vulnerable. I was a target. Tiffany, ever the supportive wife, nodded gravely. "It's just terrifying what these people are capable of. They can sound so convincing on the phone." She reached out and patted my hand, her touch cool and proprietary. "That's why we were thinking," she chimed in, her voice a syrupy blend of false empathy and steely resolve. "It might be a good idea to add Daniel's name to your bank accounts, just as a safeguard. That way, if anyone ever tried to take advantage of your good nature, he could step in immediately and stop them." Stop. I looked from Daniel's earnest, pleading face to Tiffany's sharp, watchful eyes. They were a perfect portrait of feigned worry. They spoke of anonymous scammers from far-off lands, of shadowy figures on the other end of a phone line. But the real threat was sitting right across from me, sipping my tea from my grandmother's porcelain cups. They didn't want to protect my money from strangers. They wanted to protect it for themselves. They weren't offering me a shield. They were offering me a leash gilded with the language of love. This was their first major push the moment they moved from subtle suggestion to a direct request for access. It was a test. They were probing my defenses, checking to see if the slow erosion of my confidence had finally created a breach. I simply smiled, a quiet, non-committal smile that I had perfected over the past year. It was a smile that revealed nothing and conceded nothing. "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said, my voice as calm and placid as the bay on a windless morning. "It's a lot to think about. I'll certainly give it some thought." But in my mind, a cold clarity was beginning to crystallize. This was not a conversation. This was a chess move. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that it was my turn to play. They thought they were setting a trap for a frail old woman. They had no idea they were walking into one that had been set for them years ago by a man who had loved me enough to see the future. They saw a pawn, weak and exposed. They were about to discover a queen quietly waiting on her side of the board. To understand the shield, you must understand the man who forged it. Robert knew his own mind, and he knew the sea. When the doctors gave him his diagnosis, a slow, creeping illness that would eventually steal his strength, he faced it with the same calm he faced a rising storm. There was no denial, no railing against the injustice of it all. There was only a quiet, pragmatic acceptance, and then a plan. A few weeks after we received the news, he asked me to call his oldest and most trusted friend, James Albright. James was more than just our lawyer. He was the man who had stood beside Robert at our wedding, the man who had held Daniel as a baby. He was family-bound not by blood, but by a lifetime of unwavering loyalty and shared integrity. We sat in James's quiet wood-paneled office, the air smelling of old books and rain-soaked earth. Robert, frail but with an unshakable firmness in his voice, laid out his concerns. He did not speak of his illness. He spoke of the future. "James," he said, his gaze steady, "Margaret is the most capable woman I know. She managed a household, raised a son, and navigated the chaos of a hospital ward for 40 years. But I know our boy. He has a good heart, but a weak spine. And I see the way his wife looks at this house, at our savings. She sees a finish line, not a foundation. He turned to me, then his hand covering mine. The skin was thin, but his grip was strong. "My love," he said, "I want your independence protected, absolutely and unequivocally." It was then that James explained the power of a durable power of attorney. It was not, as some believe, about giving up control. It was about choosing with a clear mind who to trust with that control, should you ever be unable to wield it yourself. It was a private declaration, a quiet transfer of authority to a hand-picked agent, a fiduciary who would be legally bound to act only in my best interest. It was a preemptive strike against the very kind of emotional coercion and legal maneuvering that Daniel and Tiffany were now attempting. That day, I signed the papers naming James Albright as my legal agent for all financial matters. It was a decision made not out of fear, but out of foresight. The document was notarized, witnessed, and filed away a silent guardian waiting in the archives of James's office. I thought of it as Robert's final gift to me, a testament to a love that was always thinking 5 steps ahead. He was a shipwright to the very end, building me a final, unsinkable vessel, a lifeboat designed to carry me safely through the storm he knew was coming. Daniel and Tiffany thought they were sailing on an open sea, a clear path to my assets. They had no idea they were sailing straight towards a hidden reef, one that Robert had charted for them years before they had even dreamed of setting sail. The final straw, the one that broke the long, aching silence of my endurance, came on a Tuesday in October. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, the kind of day that feels clean and honest. Tiffany called, her voice bright, with a manufactured cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. "We've found a wonderful new doctor who makes house calls," she announced, as if it were a delightful surprise. "He specializes in geriatric wellness. He's just going to stop by for a friendly chat. Margaret, make sure you're getting everything you need." It was not a request. It was an announcement. The ambush was already in motion. An hour later, a man I had never seen before was sitting in Robert's armchair, a smug professional smile on his face. He had a briefcase and an air of clinical detachment. This was not a friendly chat. This was an assessment. He asked me a series of condescending textbook questions designed to test my cognitive function. He asked me who the president was. He asked me to name the days of the week in reverse order. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I answered each question with a placid smile, my voice steady, my mind as clear as the cold autumn air outside. I was a nurse for 40 years. I knew a competency exam when I saw one. While the doctor was packing his bag, his performance concluded, I went to the kitchen to make tea, an act of ingrained hospitality that felt like a betrayal of myself. The kitchen door was ajar, and I heard their hushed, urgent voices from the hallway. It was Tiffany, her voice a sharp, impatient whisper. "So, is it enough? Did you get what you need for the report?" The man's voice was low, conspiratorial. Her answers were coherent. He admitted a note of frustration in his tone. "But I can frame it. I'll emphasize momentary confusion, mild cognitive decline. I'll use the right language. It should be enough to get the petition started." Then I heard my son's voice. It was not the voice of a man protecting his mother. It was the voice of a weak, greedy child, thin and reedy with complicity. "Just make it sound convincing, Doctor," Daniel said. "She's just not all there anymore. We have to do this for her own good, for her own good." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, the quiet ache in my heart that had been a constant companion for years did not break. It turned to ice. They were not my caregivers. They were my prosecutors. This was not a wellness check. It was an inquest. And this doctor was not a healer. He was their hired gun, a man paid to write a fiction that would give them the legal power to seize my life. They had just declared war, and they had no idea that I was already armed. I stood in the dim light of the hallway, the sound of their conspiracy still echoing in the quiet air. The porcelain teapot, a wedding gift from my mother, felt heavy and cold in my hands. In that moment, something inside me settled. It was not a storm of rage. It was not a tidal wave of grief. There was no firestorm of betrayal. Instead, a profound and chilling clarity descended upon me. It was the kind of sharp, absolute focus a sailor feels when the fog suddenly lifts, revealing not a safe harbor, but the jagged, unforgiving rocks that were hidden just beneath the surface all along. For months, perhaps for years, I had been trying to understand their behavior through the lens of family, of love, of misplaced concern. I had been making excuses for them for my own son. I had told myself he was weak, that he was caught in his wife's powerful orbit. I had been wrong. This was not weakness. This was a choice. This had nothing to do with my well-being. This was about the house on the water. It was about Robert's pension. It was about the portfolio of investments we had so carefully and quietly built over a lifetime of prudent saving. They saw me not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a stubborn, inconvenient lock on a treasure chest. And they had just hired a professional to pick it. I was no longer a person in their eyes. I was an obstacle, a line item on a budget that needed to be managed and ultimately liquidated. And in that cold, quiet moment, standing in the home I had built, I understood that motherhood is not a contract for endless forgiveness. It is not a lifelong sentence of martyrdom. My love for my son had not expired, but my tolerance for his disrespect for his profound and greedy betrayal had. I would not be a ghost in my own home. I would not be a footnote in my own story, an anecdote they would tell with sad, shaking heads at my funeral. The woman they thought was fading away, the woman they were so eager to label as incompetent, was about to remember herself. She was about to remember the strength it took to be a nurse, the precision, the calm under pressure. She was about to remember the resilience of a woman who had stood by her husband through sickness and health, who had managed a household on a tight budget, who had raised a child and paid for his education. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for surrender. They had mistaken my age for weakness. It was a fatal miscalculation. I was not the frail woman in their fabricated report. I was not the victim in the story they were trying to write. I was the author, and I was about to write a new chapter. I was done pretending not to notice. I was done being quiet. And I was not crazy. I was just planning. The next morning, after Daniel and Tiffany had left their false sympathy still hanging in the air like a cheap perfume, I sat down at the old secretary desk where Robert used to chart his courses. The house was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic breathing of the ocean outside, a sound that has been the constant metronome of my life. I did not pace. I did not wring my hands. I did not indulge in the chaotic release of tears. My grief had already turned to granite. My actions now would be as precise and as deliberate as a surgeon's incision. I picked up the heavy black telephone and dialed a number I knew by heart, a number I had not needed to call for several years. James Albright answered on the second ring, his voice as steady and reassuring as I remembered it from that day in his office. "Margaret," he said, and there was a genuine warmth in his voice that felt like a lifeline in a cold sea. "It's good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" I took a slow, measured breath, letting the salty air fill my lungs. "James." I began my own voice, calm, devoid of the tremor I had feigned for their doctor. "They're making their move." I recounted the events of the previous day with the dispassionate clarity of a nurse giving a report. I detailed the visit from the hired doctor. I repeated the words I had overheard the casual conspiracy to frame my mental state. I laid out the slow, insidious campaign of the past year, connecting the dots of their helpful suggestions and feigned concerns into the clear picture of a premeditated assault. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I knew it was not a silence of surprise but of contemplation, of a sad and weary confirmation. "Robert saw this coming," James said finally, his voice laced with a deep, mournful respect for his old friend. "He always said you were the rock Margaret, but that even the strongest rock needs a seawall to break the waves. He wanted to be your seawall." He paused, and I could hear the rustle of papers. "The power of attorney we drafted is durable and legally ironclad. You gave me the authority to act as your fiduciary agent years ago in a time of perfect clarity. They are trying to build a case that you are incompetent, but they have no idea that your financial house has been in perfect professional order under my legal supervision all along. Their petition, when it comes, will be built on a foundation of sand. A sense of profound, quiet peace settled over me, a peace I had not felt in years. It was the feeling of knowing your defenses are not only in place, but that your opponents are utterly unaware of their existence. The shield Robert had helped me forge was about to be tested. The trap laid with love and foresight was set. All I had to do now was let them walk into it. My part in this drama was to simply wait and to remember the strength of the man who had loved me enough to protect me even after he was gone. In the days that followed, James laid out their strategy as if he were reading from a predictable, well-worn playbook for the greedy and impatient. His voice on the phone was a calm anchor in the turbulent waters of my situation. "They will file a petition for conservatorship with the probate court." He explained, his tone devoid of any alarm. This was not a crisis to him. It was a legal problem with a clear solution. "They will claim you are susceptible to undue influence and are no longer capable of managing your complex financial affairs. Their key piece of evidence will be the report from their expert witness, the doctor. It will be filled with clinical, intimidating language designed to paint a picture of a confused and rapidly declining woman." He paused, letting the weight of their plan settle. "They will then request that the court appoint Daniel as your conservator, giving him complete legal control over your assets, your property, your medical decisions, everything. They will frame it as a loving, necessary act to protect you from yourself." I could almost see them in my mind's eye standing before a judge, their faces etched with feigned concern. Then James explained our defense, which was not a defense at all, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. "We will not argue about your mental state, Margaret," he said firmly. "That would be falling into their trap, turning the courtroom into a debate about your memories and your faculties. We will not put you on the stand to be cross-examined and humiliated. We will let them build their entire case. We will let them present their doctor, their anecdotes, their carefully constructed fiction." His strategy was one of profound, quiet power. It mirrored my own silence. Then, at the appropriate moment, he continued, "I will stand up and I will present the court with the notarized, fully executed durable power of attorney you signed 7 years ago. I will then present a full audited accounting of your entire estate prepared by my firm, demonstrating that your finances have been and continue to be managed with the utmost professional care and prudence under my legal authority as per your explicit long-standing instructions. The beauty of the plan was in its elegant simplicity. Their entire case was predicated on the idea that my finances were in jeopardy, that I was a ship without a captain heading for the rocks. They were preparing for a battle on a field that no longer existed. They were trying to prove I was unfit to manage my affairs, while we would prove with irrefutable documentation that my affairs were already being managed by a legal professional of my own choosing. They were building a case against a phantom, a caricature of me they had invented for their own purposes. They were attacking a fortress, believing it to be a house of straw. The stage was set. The script was written. And they had no idea they were not the heroes of this story. Knowing their strategy gave me a quiet, almost thrilling sense of purpose. For their plan to work, they needed to believe they were winning. They needed to be absolutely confident in my decline. So in the weeks that followed, as the gears of the legal system slowly began to turn, I gave the performance of a lifetime. I became the woman they wanted to see, the woman their lawyer would describe in court. I embraced the role of the frail, confused matriarch with a quiet, methodical dedication. When Tiffany would ask with that cloying sweetness in her voice if I'd taken my pills, I would look at the clearly labeled pill organizer with a theatrical confusion. "Oh dear," I'd murmur, my brow furrowed. "I just can't seem to remember. It all gets so jumbled." I would let her guide my hand, her smug satisfaction a palpable thing in the air between us. When Daniel brought over bank statements for me to review a new ritual in their campaign of helping, I'd hold them upside down and squint, complaining that the numbers were just a confusing jumble these days. They would exchange triumphant knowing glances over my head, certain of my deterioration. Their overconfidence was my greatest ally. Their condescension became thicker, more blatant, as they grew more certain of their imminent victory. They stopped hiding their intentions, believing I was no longer sharp enough to perceive them. One evening, as they were visiting, I left a small digital audio recorder, a gift from Robert years ago, for recording bird calls tucked inside my knitting basket on the side table. As I pretended to doze in my armchair, I heard them discussing their plans for the house, for my house. "We'll need to sell off most of this dark, heavy furniture," Tiffany said. Her voice filled with the excitement of an interior designer planning a new project. "It's so gloomy. I'm thinking a much more modern, open-plan look. We could take out that wall between the kitchen and the dining room." Daniel, my son, agreed readily. "Absolutely. It would really open up the space. We could put in a big island." They were redecorating a house that was not yet theirs. They were spending money that was not yet theirs. They were erasing me from my own home before I was even gone. I sat there, eyes closed, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Let them plan. Let them dream. Every word they spoke was another thread in the web they were weaving for themselves. They were so busy planning their victory, so blinded by their own greed, they never once stopped to consider that the quiet, forgetful old woman in the corner was not just listening. She was recording. She was gathering evidence. She was preparing for war, all while pretending to be its first casualty. The official notice, the legal declaration of their war against me, arrived on a cold November afternoon. The sky was the color of slate, and a bitter wind was whipping off the bay. Daniel and Tiffany came over together, a united front, their faces composed in carefully rehearsed masks of solemn duty. Daniel held a large manila envelope, clutching it like a grim but necessary burden. He didn't meet my eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice heavy with a false regret that was almost impressive in its theatricality. "This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do." He placed the envelope on the dining room table, its sharp corners a stark contrast to the soft, worn wood. "We've filed a petition with the court. It's for your own good. We're just so worried about you, about what might happen." Tiffany stood a step behind him, a hand placed proprietarily on his shoulder, the perfect silent image of a supportive wife enduring a painful family crisis. But I saw the glint in her eye, a flicker of pure, unadulterated triumph. She thought they had won. She believed this piece of paper filled with its cold legal jargon was the final nail in the coffin of my independence. This was their checkmate. I looked from the clinical starkness of the envelope to their faces, a study in feigned sympathy and smug righteousness. It was a performance, and it was my cue. I let my breath catch in my throat. I allowed a single well-timed tear to well in my eye, to trace a slow, sorrowful path down my cheek. I let my hand tremble as I reached for the papers, my fingers brushing against the crisp edge of the envelope. I don't understand." I whispered, my voice a frail, confused echo of my true self. It was the voice they expected to hear, the voice of the woman they had invented. Daniel patted my hand, his touch both patronizing and dismissive. "It's okay, Mom," he said soothingly. His words meant to comfort, but landing like stones. "You don't have to understand. We'll take care of everything now." They left a few minutes later, their duty done, their consciences clear. They were so convinced of their righteous victory, so sure of the part I was playing. They were leaving the stage believing the play was over. I waited until I heard the sound of their car pulling away, its engine fading into the moan of the wind. Only then did I wipe the tear from my face, my expression hardening from one of soft confusion to cold resolve. I picked up the envelope. I did not need to read it. I already knew every line. The stage was now officially set, and they had no idea I was the director. The night before the hearing, I did not feel fear. I did not pace the floors of the house that was no longer just a home, but a battleground. I did not sit up worrying, rehearsing my lines, or imagining the worst. Instead, I felt a profound sense of calm, the deep, settled peace of a ship that has been made ready for a storm. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the steam warming my face, and sat in Robert's armchair, the worn leather cool and familiar against my skin. The house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of a life well lived. I didn't review legal papers with James. I didn't need to. Our strategy was set as solid and dependable as the granite coastline outside my window. Instead, I opened the old photo album, its pages soft and yielding with time. There was Robert and me on our wedding day, young and impossibly hopeful. There we were on the steps of this very house, holding a tiny bundled Daniel, his face a perfect miniature version of his father's. There we were years later, older, grayer, but his hand still firmly in mine, standing on the deck and looking out at the endless expanse of the sea. I was not fighting for money. I was not fighting for property. I was fighting for the woman in those photographs. I was fighting for the life that she and her husband had so carefully, so lovingly constructed, piece by patient piece. Their attempt to declare me unfit to label me as a fragile relic of the past was an attempt to say that her life, my life, was over, that my story was finished, and it was time for them to write the epilogue, an epilogue in which they were the sole beneficiaries. They wanted to close the book on my life while I was still living it. I closed the heavy album and looked out the dark window. The rhythmic sweeping beam from the Bass Harbor headlight cut through the blackness, a steady, unwavering pulse in the vast, indifferent night. It was a constant, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is a guiding light. "It's all right, Robert," I whispered into the quiet room, my voice steady. "I've got this." My strength on the eve of this battle did not come from anger, though I had a right to be angry. It did not come from a desire for revenge, though the thought of their faces when the truth was revealed brought a grim satisfaction. My strength came from a deep, abiding love for the life I had lived for the man I had loved, and for the quiet dignity that was my birthright. It came from a firm, unshakable resolve to be the sole author of my own final chapters. They could bring their lawyers, their doctors, and their lies. I was bringing a lifetime of truth. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, all polished dark wood and hushed formal tones that smelled of floor wax and institutional anxiety. Daniel and Tiffany sat at the petitioner's table dressed in somber colors, their faces meticulously arranged into masks of pained responsibility. They looked every bit the dutiful, worried children forced into a terrible but necessary action. It was a masterful performance. Their lawyer, a slick young man with a confident, predatory smile and hair that looked like it had been sculpted from black lacquer, stood and began to weave his narrative. He spoke of my increasing isolation, my episodes of confusion, my inability to manage complex financial decisions. He presented the report from the doctor, their hired gun, and read excerpts aloud. The clinical language, stripped of all humanity, was damning. He used phrases like cognitive slippage, impaired executive function, and a marked decline from her baseline. He was creating a medical fiction, a character sketch of a woman lost in the fog of her own mind. He then called Daniel to the stand. My son, my only child, walked to the witness box with his head bowed. He spoke tearfully, his voice thick with emotion, of finding unpaid bills in my desk drawer bills I had already paid online. He recounted with a pained expression the time I held a bank statement upside down, a moment of pure theater he had swallowed whole. He told the judge how I often seemed to be in a world of my own, how he and his wife worried constantly that I would fall prey to a scam or simply forget to eat. Every word was a carefully chosen brushstroke, painting a portrait of a woman who was no longer there, a fragile shell in need of their benevolent protection. Tiffany sat at the table, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She was the perfect picture of a grieving daughter-in-law, her heart breaking for the mother she was losing. I sat beside James, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my back straight. I listened to this fictional account of my life without expression. I could feel the judge's sympathetic gaze upon me, the gentle pity in his eyes. From the outside, their case looked airtight. It was compassionate. It was convincing. It was a fortress of lies built with the bricks of my love and the mortar of their greed. They had presented their case. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the frail, confused old woman to be led from the room, her life no longer her own. They had no idea the trial was only just beginning. When their lawyer finished his eloquent and damning closing statement, the judge turned to our table. His expression was one of gentle, weary pity. "Mr. Albright," he said, his voice soft, "does the respondent have anything to say?" This was the moment, the quiet reckoning. James rose slowly from his chair, a simple, unassuming leather-bound folder in his hand. He did not approach the witness stand. He did not call me to testify to defend my own sanity. He simply addressed the judge, his voice calm and respectful, yet carrying an authority that instantly commanded the room's attention. "Your Honor," he began, "my client, Mrs. Margaret Hale, will not be contesting the picture of her that the petitioners have so diligently, if inaccurately, painted this morning. We will not be arguing about her memory, her day-to-day habits, or her ability to manage her affairs." I saw a flicker of triumphant confusion pass between Daniel and Tiffany. Their lawyer smirked, a small, arrogant twitch of his lips. They thought we were conceding. "Because, Your Honor." James continued, his voice dropping slightly for emphasis, each word landing with the weight of a stone. "It is entirely and fundamentally irrelevant." He opened the folder. The sound of the clasp clicking open was like a gunshot in the silent room. "What I have here," he said, holding up a single crisp document, "is a durable power of attorney executed by Mrs. Hale 7 years ago, naming myself a licensed attorney in good standing and an officer of this court as her sole legal agent in all financial matters." This document was signed when Mrs. Hale was in perfect health, with her late husband, Mr. Robert Hale, serving as a witness. "It grants me complete and irrevocable fiduciary authority over her estate." He then placed a second, much thicker document on the judge's bench with a soft, definitive thud. "And this, Your Honor," he said, "is a full, professionally audited accounting of Mrs. Hale's entire estate prepared by my firm. It demonstrates with irrefutable clarity that her finances have been and continue to be managed with the utmost professional care and prudence, according to her long-standing and clearly articulated wishes." The petitioner's entire case is predicated on the flimsy notion that Mrs. Hale's finances are in jeopardy. As you can now plainly see, they have never been more secure. It was not an argument. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact, a quiet, unassailable truth that landed in the middle of their carefully constructed fiction and blew it to pieces. There was no need for a debate. The paper didn't forget. The reckoning had arrived not with a shout, but with the quiet, devastating whisper of a legal document. A profound, deafening silence descended upon the courtroom. The air, which had been thick with their lies and false sympathy, was suddenly thin and cold. The judge, a man who had likely seen every form of human drama, picked up the power of attorney, his eyes scanning the document with a careful, deliberate pace. He then leafed through the first few pages of the financial records, his expression shifting from one of weary pity to one of stern, dawning comprehension. The smug, confident smirk on their lawyer's face dissolved, as if it had been wiped clean with a wet cloth. It was replaced by a pale, slack-jawed confusion. He looked from the documents on the judge's bench to James and then to Daniel and Tiffany, his eyes wide with the panic of a captain whose ship has just struck an uncharted reef. Tiffany's hand, which had been resting so supportively on Daniel's back, fell to her side as if she'd been burned. The color drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a garish mask on a statue. But it was my son's face that I watched most closely. The mask of sorrowful duty, the one he had worn so convincingly, crumbled. It fell away to reveal the raw, panicked face of a boy who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. There was no defiance, no anger. There was only the naked, humiliating terror of being exposed. The judge finally put down the papers and looked at them, not at me, but directly at them over the top of his spectacles. His voice, once gentle and accommodating, was now laced with an icy judicial steel. "A petition for conservatorship," he said, each word a cold, hard stone, "is an extreme legal measure reserved for the most vulnerable among us who can no longer protect themselves. It is not," He paused, his gaze boring into my son, a tool for impatient heirs to expedite an inheritance. He let the words hang in the silent room. You have brought a petition before this court based on a foundation of falsehoods and misrepresentations. You have wasted the court's time, and you have attempted to strip your own mother of her fundamental rights under the guise of concern. For the first time, I looked directly at Daniel. Our eyes met across the courtroom. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply held his gaze, letting him see the woman he had so profoundly underestimated. He looked away. The judge struck his gavel once. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute, a sharp crack of finality that echoed in the silent room. Petition denied, he declared, his voice ringing with authority. With prejudice. This matter is closed. It was over. Their carefully constructed narrative, their stage play of loving concern, had been demolished by a single quiet truth. Their scheme had fallen apart, not with a bang, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the soft rustling sound of a few pieces of paper that spoke more loudly and more truthfully than they ever could. I went home. As James drove me back along the winding coastal road, I watched the familiar landscape rush by, but it looked different. The sky seemed brighter, the color of the sea more intensely blue. The house, when I walked inside, felt lighter. The air, which for months had been thick and heavy with their condescension and my own silent grief, was now clean and sharp with the smell of the ocean. The quiet was no longer the oppressive quiet of loneliness, but the deep, restorative quiet of peace. The phone began to ring that evening. Daniel. An hour later, Tiffany. Then Daniel again. The calls became more frequent over the next few days, more frantic. Voicemails began to pile up, little digital ghosts of their panic. Pleading, angry, confused messages that I did not listen to. I simply watched the number of missed calls climb on the screen, 10, 20, 50, then the iconic 99 plus, a symbol, not of my stress, but of my liberation. Each unanswered call was a brick in the new wall I was building around my life, a wall of quiet, unbreachable peace. A week later, James came to the house not as a lawyer preparing for a battle, but as an old friend helping to secure a victory. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and Tiffany had laid out their articles about elderly scams, and I signed the final papers. With a few strokes of a pen, I transferred all my assets, the house, the savings, Robert's pension, the investment portfolio, into an irrevocable trust. James would remain the trustee, the keeper of the keys, the guardian of the legacy Robert and I had built. It was the final step, the quiet, decisive closing of a door that would never be opened to them again. Daniel had no legal claim, no financial tether, no path back into my life unless I chose to grant it. And I would not be granting it. I did not lose a son that day in court. I lost the painful, lingering illusion that he had ever truly seen me, the mother who had raised him. I had lost the hope that he would one day become the man his father had been. Some losses are not losses at all. They are clarifications. My mornings are quieter now, but it is a different kind of quiet. Not the kind of quiet that aches with loneliness, but the kind that feels like a soft, long exhale after holding your breath for years. I walk on the beach. I paint my watercolors of the shifting sea and sky, and I breathe air that is entirely, unapologetically my own. I did not win a fortune. I reclaimed a life. Peace, I have learned, doesn't need applause. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be owned. I am sitting now in Robert's armchair, looking out at the bay as the evening sun turns the water to liquid gold. The tide is coming in a slow, steady, inevitable rhythm that has marked all the days of my life. I did not keep their respect, but I have kept my peace. I did not keep their love, but I have kept my dignity. And I have learned that clarity is a quiet victory, one that needs no applause. My son and his wife tried to write the final chapter of my life, a sad little story about a confused old woman who faded away. But they forgot one important thing: I am the one holding the pen. And so I speak now, not just for myself, but for all of us who have been asked to quietly disappear. If you have ever been made to feel that your age is a liability, that your wisdom is a weakness, if your stories have been dismissed as the ramblings of a fading mind, if you have ever been called a burden by the very people you once carried on your back, then hear this: you are not alone. They see our silence and they call it surrender. They see our patience and they call it weakness. They see our kindness and they call it an opportunity. They build their futures on the foundations of our past sacrifices and then grow impatient when we refuse to become the silent, convenient ghosts in the houses we built. They try to erase us slowly, gently, with helpful suggestions and feigned concern, until we begin to doubt our own minds, our own memories, our own worth. But we are the keepers of the memories. We are the archivists of the quiet truths. We are the foundation, and when the foundation is removed, the entire house falls. Motherhood is not a contract for endless forgiveness, and love is not a license for disrespect. There comes a time when the duty to oneself, to one's own dignity, surpasses the obligation to children who have forgotten the meaning of the word. Do not wait for them to remember who you are. Remember it for yourself. Your worth does not expire with age. Your strength does not diminish when your hands grow tired. Your story is not over just because they are ready for the epilogue. Keep your name on the deed. Keep your own counsel. Keep the receipts both literal and metaphorical. And know that the most powerful weapon you will ever possess is a clear mind, a quiet resolve, and the unshakable knowledge of your own value. Paper, my dear friends, never forgets, and neither should you. They cannot erase a story whose author simply refuses to put down the pen. Thank you for watching Her Quiet Revenge. True stories. If these stories of quiet strength and reclaimed dignity resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge. True stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Your support helps us continue to give a voice to those who were underestimated. We'll see you in the next story.